In the humid summer of 1847, insurance investigator Samuel Hartwell discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. 17 life insurance policies had been claimed along the Charleston-Columbia Road in just 8 months, all involving healthy men between 25 and 50 years old, all dying from sudden heart failure while staying at roadside inns. What made these deaths particularly disturbing wasn't just their frequency, but the fact that each victim had been found with a peculiar sweet smell on their breath and oleander petals scattered mysteriously around their rooms. The local authorities had dismissed these deaths as natural, citing the notorious health risks of low-country travel during the humid months. But Hartwell's investigation would uncover a web of calculated murder, so methodical, so coldly executed by the most unlikely of killers, that it would forever change how Charleston's elite viewed the charming hostesses who welcomed weary travelers into the bar homes. Each death had occurred under nearly identical circumstances. Successful businessmen arriving at country inns after long journeys, complaining of exhaustion, and accepting special remedies from caring proprietresses, then succumbing to mysterious heart ailments within hours of their arrival. The insurance payouts had totaled over $85,000, a fortune that someone was systematically collecting from grieving families who never questioned the convenient timing of these policies. Before we continue with the story of the 6-mile Wayfarer house and the woman who turned Southern hospitality into a deadly art form, if you're enjoying these dark tales from America's forgotten past, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts who appreciate the darker chapters of American history. The truth about Lavinia Fisher would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined, and the evidence Hartwell uncovered would reveal that the most dangerous predator on South Carolina's roads wore silk dresses, quoted scripture at church socials, and served poisoned tea with a smile that could melt the heart of any man foolish enough to trust in the inherent goodness of feminine virtue. Charleston in 1847 stood as one of the South's most prosperous ports. Its cobblestone streets lined with grand mansions where rice and cotton fortunes had built architectural marvels that rivaled anything found in London or Paris. The Ashley and Cooper rivers embraced the peninsula like protective arms, their waters reflecting the spires of St. Michael's Church and the elegant columns of countless plantation houses. Spanish moss draped from ancient live oaks created an almost ethereal beauty that masked the city's darker undercurrents. The brutal reality of slavery, the cutthroat competition among merchants, and the social pressures that could destroy reputations with a single whispered rumor. This was a society built on rigid hierarchies where bloodlines mattered more than wealth, though wealth certainly helped. The Charleston elite maintained their positions through careful marriages, strategic business partnerships, and an unspoken code of conduct that valued appearance over substance. Ladies were expected to be ornamental and pure, their accomplishments limited to watercolor painting, French conversation, and the delicate art of managing household slaves. Any woman who stepped outside these boundaries faced social ostracism that could extend to her entire family. The road between Charleston and Columbia had become increasingly vital as inland plantations expanded and merchants sought new markets for their goods. Cotton brokers, land speculators, rice planters, and tobacco merchants regularly made this journey, often carrying substantial sums of money, important legal documents, and detailed information about their business operations. The route was notorious for its isolation, winding through dense pine forests where highwaymen were known to operate, crossing treacherous swamplands where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and alligators lurked in murky waters that could conceal evidence of crimes for decades. Travel accommodations along this route varied dramatically in quality and safety. Some establishments catered to wealthy planters and offered genuine luxury, while others provided little more than a roof and a meal of questionable origin. Experienced travelers knew to research their stopping points carefully, relying on recommendations from trusted associates and avoiding any inn that couldn't provide references from respectable Charleston families. Samuel Hartwell, 34 years old and representing Mutual Assurance Company of Virginia, had arrived in Charleston with a reputation for solving impossible cases that other investigators had abandoned as hopeless. His methodical nature, Harvard education, and willingness to spend months pursuing seemingly insignificant details made him an oddity among the more genteel Southern investigators who preferred obvious solutions to complex problems. His success rate spoke for itself. In 12 years of investigative work, he had never failed to solve a case once he committed to pursuing it. The unusual cluster of insurance claims had initially appeared routine to Mutual Assurance's Charleston office. Sudden deaths among middle-aged businessmen were hardly uncommon in a region where yellow fever, malaria, and cholera could strike without warning. The hot, humid climate took its toll on anyone not accustomed to low-country conditions, and the stress of constant travel often proved fatal to men who pushed themselves beyond their physical limits. However, Hartwell's trained eye had detected patterns that local investigators had missed or chosen to ignore. Each victim had been in apparent good health when they purchased their insurance policies, usually within 6 months of their deaths. Each had died while traveling alone, without family members present to ask uncomfortable questions. Most significantly, each policy had been sold by the same insurance agent, a mysterious woman who seemed to appear and disappear along the travel routes like a ghost. The 6-mile Wayfarer house sat exactly 6 miles north of Charleston's city limits, positioned strategically where the main road curved around Goose Creek before entering a stretch of particularly dense forest. Built in the Georgian style with wide piazzas designed to catch every available breeze, towering white columns, and floor-to-ceiling windows that could be opened during cooler months, it appeared to be the epitome of Southern hospitality and refined taste. The building's placement had been chosen carefully by someone who understood both the needs of travelers and the advantages of isolation. Weary journeyers appreciated finding elegant accommodations just far enough from Charleston to escape the city's noise and odors, but close enough to reach civilization if emergencies arose. The surrounding landscape provided natural privacy, dense woods on 3 sides and Goose Creek swampland on the 4th, ensuring that any activities at the inn would remain unobserved by curious neighbors. The property had been purchased 3 years earlier by John and Lavinia Fisher, who claimed to have acquired it with money John had inherited from a deceased uncle in Savannah. Local records showed they had paid cash for the substantial property, immediately beginning renovations that transformed a rundown coaching inn into one of the most elegant stopping places between Charleston and Columbia. Their investment in Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, and imported furniture suggested either enormous confidence in their business prospects or access to funds far beyond what most innkeepers could command. Lavinia Fisher possessed the kind of beauty that made strong men forget their own names and abandon their carefully planned business strategies. At 26, she stood unusually tall for a woman of her era, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like burnished copper and green eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Her complexion was flawless, despite spending time in the brutal South Carolina sun, and her figure was perfectly proportioned in an age when feminine beauty was strictly defined by precise measurements and careful corseting. More dangerous than her physical beauty was her manner. Lavinia possessed an almost supernatural ability to make each person she encountered feel as though they were the most fascinating individual she had ever met. Her voice carried the musical quality of low-country aristocracy, that distinctive accent that marked Charleston's highest social circles and immediately identified its speaker as someone worthy of respect and attention. She moved with practiced grace that suggested years of dancing lessons and deportment training, yet there was nothing artificial about her charm. Those who met her invariably commented on her extraordinary intelligence and her gift for remembering personal details that most people would forget within minutes. She could recall a man's children's names months after a brief conversation, inquire about specific business ventures with genuine apparent interest, and offer sympathy for family difficulties that had been mentioned only in passing. This attention to detail made her guests feel valued and appreciated in ways their own families often failed to achieve. John Fisher, by contrast, was unremarkable in almost every way, a fact that made their partnership all the more effective. Short and stocky, with thinning brown hair and forgettable features, he possessed the kind of invisibility that allowed him to move through the world unnoticed and unremembered. Neighbors described him as quiet, hard-working, and devoted to his beautiful wife with an intensity that bordered on worship. While Lavinia charmed guests and managed the inn's social functions, John handled practical matters with methodical efficiency. He maintained the grounds with obsessive care, ensuring that every flower bed was perfectly maintained and every building surface was spotlessly clean. His carpentry skills were exceptional, and he was always willing to help neighbors with difficult repairs or construction projects. The local community viewed him as a valuable asset, reliable, skilled, and completely trustworthy. The first death that caught Hartwell's attention had occurred on February 14, 1847, Valentine's Day, though the irony would only become apparent months later when the full scope of the Fishers' crimes was revealed. Cotton merchant Theodore Grayson had arrived at the 6-mile Wayfarer house late in the afternoon, his carriage loaded with samples and contracts from his successful Charleston negotiations. At 48 years old, Grayson was known throughout the region as a shrewd businessman who had built a fortune by understanding both the technical aspects of cotton production and the psychological weaknesses of his competitors. According to the detailed report filed by local magistrate Cornelius Weatherby, a document that Hartwell would study line by line in the months that followed, Grayson had appeared tired but otherwise healthy when he arrived at the inn. The day had been unusually warm for February, with temperatures reaching nearly 70 degrees, and Grayson had complained of fatigue from his journey and the oppressive humidity that seemed to sap energy from even the most experienced travelers. Lavinia had greeted him personally at the front entrance, a practice that distinguished her establishment from more mundane inns where guests were met by servants or stable boys. She had immediately noticed his exhaustion and insisted on preparing a special restorative tea that she claimed had been renowned throughout the Charleston area for its miraculous healing properties. The recipe, she explained, had been passed down through generations of her family and contained flowers from her own carefully tended garden. The other guests present that evening, a rice planter named Harrison Calhoun and a tobacco inspector from North Carolina named Wesley Dupree, would later provide testimony that painted a vivid picture of Grayson's final hours. Both men described how Lavinia had treated the cotton merchant with extraordinary attention, personally ensuring that his every comfort was attended to, while maintaining engaging conversation that seemed to revitalize his spirits despite his physical exhaustion. The tea itself had been served in one of Lavinia's finest china cups, decorated with delicate pink roses that perfectly complemented the beverage's unusual color. Grayson had praised its distinctive flavor immediately, mentioning notes of honey and something floral that he couldn't quite identify but found incredibly pleasant. The warmth and sweetness seemed to restore his energy, and for nearly an hour he regaled his fellow guests with stories of his business adventures and plans for expanding his operations into Georgia. The transformation in Grayson's condition began gradually, so subtly that none of the witnesses initially recognized it as anything more serious than renewed fatigue. He began speaking more slowly, pausing occasionally as if searching for words that had momentarily escaped him. His complexion, which had been flushed from the warm weather, began to take on a grayish pallor that Lavinia attributed to the natural effects of relaxation after a stressful journey. By 9 o'clock, Grayson was complaining of chest pains and difficulty breathing. Lavinia immediately took charge of the situation, directing John to fetch Dr. Pemberton from Charleston, while she personally attended to their suffering guest. She helped him to his room, ensuring that he was comfortable and had everything he might need while they waited for medical assistance to arrive. Dr. Reginald Pemberton, Charleston's most respected physician despite his 73 years, arrived near midnight to find Grayson in severe distress. The patient's pupils were severely dilated, his breathing was labored and irregular, and there was a distinctive almond-like smell that seemed to cling to his clothes and permeate the entire room. Dr. Pemberton's examination revealed an irregular heartbeat and signs of severe poisoning, though he was unable to identify the specific substance responsible. Despite the doctor's efforts, Theodore Grayson died at approximately 2 in the morning on February 15th. His body was found in a state that struck Dr. Pemberton as unusual, positioned peacefully in the bed as if he had simply fallen asleep, with no signs of the violent convulsions that typically accompanied poisoning cases. More mysteriously, several pink oleander petals were discovered scattered across the wooden floor around his bed, though neither Dr. Pemberton nor anyone else could explain their presence. What struck Hartwell as particularly suspicious when he later reviewed the case was Lavinia's behavior throughout the medical crisis. Multiple witnesses reported that she had remained remarkably composed and efficient, displaying none of the hysteria or panic that would have been expected from a woman witnessing such a traumatic event. She had personally cleaned and arranged Grayson's room before Dr. Pemberton's arrival, explaining that she couldn't bear to leave the poor man in an undignified state during his final moments. When questioned about the oleander petals by Magistrate Weatherby, Lavinia had provided what seemed like a reasonable explanation. She suggested that they must have blown in through the window from her garden, where she maintained several ornamental oleander bushes for their beautiful pink flowers. The fact that February was hardly the season for blooming oleander in South Carolina appeared not to have occurred to anyone involved in the initial investigation. The insurance claim filed by Grayson's business partner, Marcus Redmond, had been processed without incident by Mutual Assurance's Charleston office. The company paid out the substantial sum of $5,000, nearly 10 years' wages for most working men, noting in their files that Grayson had been in apparent good health when he purchased the policy just 4 months earlier. The policy had been sold by Laura Ferguson, an insurance agent from Augusta whose credentials and references had all appeared to be in perfect order. But Theodore Grayson was only the beginning of what would prove to be the most systematic murder campaign in South Carolina's history. As the spring of 1847 warmed the Low Country and brought the familiar cycles of planting and commerce back to full activity, the deaths continued with a disturbing regularity that should have aroused suspicion among local authorities. However, the scattered nature of the incidents across multiple jurisdictions, combined with the apparent respectability of those involved, allowed the pattern to remain hidden from everyone except the most careful observers. In March, tobacco inspector William Claiborne died under nearly identical circumstances at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house. Claiborne, a respected official from the North Carolina Tobacco Commission, had been traveling to Charleston to investigate reports of quality irregularities in shipments bound for European markets. His sudden death was attributed to the stress of his investigation, combined with his unfamiliarity with South Carolina's climate, though several details of his final evening troubled the attending physician. Like Grayson before him, Claiborne had arrived at the inn complaining of travel fatigue and had been personally attended by Lavinia, who prepared her special restorative tea with the same caring attention she had shown the previous victim. The other guests present that evening later recalled how the tobacco inspector had praised the beverage's unique flavor and seemed to revive considerably after drinking it. However, within 2 hours he was experiencing severe chest pains and difficulty breathing that progressed rapidly to complete cardiac failure. Dr. Pemberton, summoned once again from Charleston, found Claiborne's body in the same peaceful position that had characterized Grayson's death, with the same distinctive almond-like odor and the same mysterious scattering of pink oleander petals around the room. The physician's growing concerns about these similarities were offset by his recognition that coincidences, however unlikely, did occasionally occur in medical practice. April brought the death of land surveyor Edgar Beaumont, whose work mapping plantation boundaries for wealthy Charleston families had made him one of the most trusted professionals in his field. Beaumont's demise followed the established pattern so closely that a more suspicious investigator might have recognized the deliberate nature of what was occurring. However, The local authorities continued to treat each incident as an isolated tragedy, failing to recognize the systematic nature of what was clearly a carefully planned criminal enterprise. The spring deaths were followed by an escalation in both frequency and brazenness that suggested growing confidence on the part of whoever was responsible. May brought 2 more victims: rice plantation owner James Rutledge from Georgetown and merchant Thomas Bellingham from Columbia. Both men died within a week of each other, both at the 6-mile Wayfarer house, both after drinking Lavinia's special tea. The local community had begun to whisper about the inn's apparent curse, with some of the more superstitious residents suggesting that the property might be built on cursed ground or haunted by the spirits of travelers who had died there in previous decades. However, these concerns were tempered by genuine affection for the Fisher family, who had become increasingly prominent in local social and religious circles. Lavinia had established herself as one of the area's most generous benefactors, contributing substantial sums to the local Methodist Church and organizing charitable activities for families affected by various disasters. Her sewing circles had become social events that the area's most respectable ladies eagerly attended, and her knowledge of literature, music, and current events made her a sought-after conversationalist at dinner parties and social gatherings. Her charitable work extended beyond mere financial contributions. During the devastating hurricane of 1846, Lavinia had personally nursed several neighbors through injuries and illness, working tirelessly to provide food, clothing, and medical care to families who had lost everything. When yellow fever struck the area the previous summer, she had volunteered to care for victims despite the obvious personal risk, earning the grateful devotion of families whose loved ones had survived due to her attentive nursing. John Fisher had earned similar respect within the community through his practical skills and reliability. He maintained not only his own property with meticulous care, but also volunteered countless hours helping neighbors with difficult construction and repair projects. His carpentry work was considered superior to that of most professional craftsmen, and he never accepted payment for his assistance, claiming that helping neighbors was simply the Christian thing to do. The couple's apparent devotion to each other had become legendary among local residents. John was frequently observed gazing at his beautiful wife with an expression of pure adoration, while Lavinia treated him with a gentle kindness that seemed to demonstrate the perfect harmony of their marriage. Their relationship appeared to embody all the romantic ideals that Southern society cherished: masculine protection and devotion combined with feminine grace and loyalty. It was during this period of growing local affection for the Fishers that Samuel Hartwell first encountered evidence that would eventually lead to their exposure. His investigation had led him to review insurance records across 3 states, searching for patterns that might explain the unusual cluster of claims along the Charleston-Columbia corridor. What he discovered was both ingenious and terrifying in its systematic execution. Several of the deceased men had purchased their life insurance policies from the same agent, a charming woman who traveled between Charleston, Savannah, and Columbia, selling substantial coverage to successful businessmen she encountered during her travels. The agent's name was Laura Ferguson, and according to the documentation provided to various insurance companies, she was a widow from Augusta who had entered the insurance business after her husband's death in a carriage accident. Laura Ferguson's sales record was extraordinary by any standard. In less than 2 years of operation, she had sold policies worth over $200,000 in total coverage, a remarkable achievement that should have made her one of the most celebrated agents in the southeastern insurance industry. Her success rate with potential clients was nearly perfect, suggesting an almost supernatural ability to convince men to purchase substantial policies, often during chance encounters at inns and taverns along major travel routes. What made Ferguson's success even more remarkable was her apparent ability to assess potential clients' financial situations with uncanny accuracy. Her policy recommendations were always precisely calibrated to each man's ability to pay premiums while maximizing the potential payout to beneficiaries. She seemed to possess detailed knowledge of her client's business operations, family situations, and travel patterns that would have required extensive investigation to obtain. Hartwell's suspicions deepened when he obtained physical descriptions of Laura Ferguson from several clients who were still alive. The woman was consistently described as exceptionally beautiful, with auburn hair and green eyes, unusually tall for a lady, and possessing a voice like music itself. Her manner was universally praised as charming, intelligent, and genuinely caring, with an extraordinary memory for personal details that made each client feel uniquely valued and understood. The description was identical in every significant detail to the accounts he had heard of Lavinia Fisher from guests at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house. Hartwell's investigation took on new urgency in early June when he learned of 3 more deaths within a single week, all following the established pattern with a precision that made coincidence impossible to believe. The victims, plantation overseer Daniel Thornton, cotton factor Robert Sinclair, and tobacco merchant George Pemberton, had died at different inns along the Charleston-Columbia corridor. But each death bore the unmistakable characteristics that Hartwell had learned to recognize. Each man had been traveling alone on business. Each had purchased life insurance within the past 6 months from Laura Ferguson. And each had died suddenly after consuming special beverages prepared by helpful hostesses at their respective inns. Most significantly, each death scene had been contaminated by the presence of oleander petals and that distinctive, sweet, almond-like odor that seemed to cling to victims' clothing and personal effects. What made these deaths particularly significant was Hartwell's discovery that all 3 men had been carrying substantial sums of money and valuable documents that had disappeared before their bodies were discovered. Local authorities had attributed these thefts to opportunistic robbery following natural deaths. But Hartwell recognized the systematic nature of what was clearly a coordinated criminal enterprise operating across multiple locations. His investigation revealed that Laura Ferguson had met each victim at carefully planned encounters that appeared coincidental but showed clear evidence of advanced preparation. Thornton had encountered her at a coaching inn in Orangeburg, where she had displayed surprising knowledge of plantation management techniques. Sinclair had met her at a Charleston coffee house, where she had impressed him with her understanding of cotton market fluctuations. Pemberton had been approached by her at a tavern in Columbia, where she had demonstrated familiarity with tobacco processing methods that few women would possess. In each case, the beautiful insurance agent had impressed her targets with knowledge of their specific business affairs and sincere concern for their family's financial security. She had convinced them that increased life insurance coverage was essential for responsible men who faced the dangers of constant travel in an era when accidents, disease, and violent crime could strike without warning. Hartwell decided that his only chance of exposing the truth would require direct confrontation with the criminal enterprise. He would need to visit the 6 Mile Wayfarer house personally, posing as a potential victim while gathering evidence that could be used to obtain arrest warrants. The plan was extremely dangerous. If his suspicions were correct, he would be placing himself in mortal peril by accepting hospitality from people who had already murdered at least 8 men. He spent several days carefully constructing his cover identity as cotton broker Samuel Henderson from Richmond, Virginia, seeking to establish business connections with South Carolina planters. His fictional background included details about family circumstances, financial status, and recent insurance purchases that would make him an attractive target for anyone seeking wealthy victims to rob and murder. Hartwell arrived at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house on a humid Thursday afternoon in late June. Having carefully studied the documented arrival times of previous victims to ensure that his behavior matched their patterns. Like them, he planned to complain of travel fatigue and accept any hospitality offered by his hosts, while secretly documenting evidence that could expose their crimes. The inn was even more impressive in person than he had imagined from witness descriptions. The building's white columns gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, while carefully maintained gardens displayed an array of flowering plants that filled the air with competing fragrances. The overall effect was one of elegant prosperity that seemed inconsistent with the modest income that a roadside inn should generate. Lavinia Fisher greeted him personally at the front entrance, and Hartwell immediately understood how she had managed to deceive so many intelligent and experienced men. Her beauty was genuinely breathtaking, but it was her manner that proved truly dangerous. Within the first few minutes of their conversation, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to make him feel as though he were the most fascinating person she had ever encountered. Her questions appeared casual and naturally curious, but Hartwell recognized the methodical way she gathered information about his supposed business operations, family background, travel plans, and financial circumstances. She displayed knowledge of cotton markets that would have impressed professional brokers, combined with feminine charm that made her inquiries seem like genuine personal interest rather than calculated intelligence gathering. "You seem like a man who takes care of his responsibilities, Mr. Henderson," she said, her green eyes holding his with unsettling intensity. "I imagine you've made proper arrangements for your family's security should anything happen during your travels." When he mentioned having recently increased his life insurance coverage through an agent he had met in Richmond, her smile became even more radiant. The expression in her eyes suggested satisfaction, as if he had just confirmed something she had hoped to discover. She insisted on preparing a special welcome refreshment, explaining that her grandmother's recipe had been renowned throughout the Charleston area for its restorative properties after long journeys. "I use flowers from my own garden," she said, gesturing toward the carefully tended beds visible through the parlor windows. "There's something about homegrown ingredients that makes all the difference. So many of our guests have told me that my special tea is quite unlike anything they've ever experienced." The casual mention of previous guests who had praised her tea sent chills down Hartwell's spine, as he realized she was probably referring to men who were now dead and buried in unmarked graves. As Lavinia busied herself in the kitchen preparing his refreshment, Hartwell took the opportunity to explore the inn's public spaces with the trained eye of a professional investigator. Every detail he observed confirmed his growing suspicions about the true nature of the Fishers' operation and the source of their obvious prosperity. The building was furnished with pieces that suggested wealth far exceeding what any legitimate roadside inn could generate. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors that showed signs of recent and expensive renovation. Oil paintings in gilded frames depicted pastoral scenes and distinguished-looking individuals who might have been ancestors or simply decorative portraits purchased to create an impression of family respectability. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings decorated with intricate plasterwork that would have required master craftsmen to create. The dining room featured a mahogany table that could easily seat 12 people, surrounded by chairs upholstered in silk fabric that would have cost more than most families earned in a year. Silver serving pieces displayed in glass-fronted cabinets bore hallmarks indicating they had been crafted by Charleston's finest artisans. What caught Hartwell's attention most were the small details that suggested recent acquisition rather than inherited wealth. The silver service showed no signs of age or wear that would indicate family heirlooms passed down through generations. The crystal glasses bore no chips or scratches, typical of pieces that had been in regular use for years. The furniture displayed none of the scuffs, stains, or minor damage that inevitably accumulated in working inns where countless guests had eaten, drunk, and occasionally been careless with valuable furnishings. Either the Fishers had inherited enormous wealth that they had chosen to invest in transforming a modest inn into a showcase of luxury, or their business was generating profits far beyond what the apparent number of guests would suggest. Given the systematic pattern of deaths and insurance claims that had brought Hartwell to investigate them, the second explanation seemed far more likely. John Fisher emerged from what appeared to be a back office, carrying ledgers and correspondence that he quickly gathered when he noticed Hartwell's presence in the parlor. The man's nervous energy seemed completely at odds with his earlier composed demeanor when greeting their new guest, and Hartwell observed how his hands trembled slightly as he organized the papers he was carrying. "Business correspondence," John explained with a forced smile that failed to reach his eyes. We maintain connections with several merchants in Columbia and Charleston for supplies and recommendations. Always important to keep proper records of our transactions and relationships." The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if John had prepared responses for anyone who might question his activities or the documents he carried. Hartwell also noted that the man seemed far more intelligent and calculating than his earlier humble demeanor had suggested, displaying the sharp awareness of someone accustomed to deception and constant vigilance. Through the kitchen door, Hartwell could hear Lavinia humming softly as she prepared his refreshment. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but something about it made him profoundly uneasy. Perhaps the realization that previous victims had probably heard the same song during their final hours of life. He found himself drawn to the kitchen doorway, where he could observe her working with practiced efficiency that suggested years of experience with whatever process she was following. She moved between different containers and jars with the precision of someone following a familiar recipe that had been refined through multiple repetitions. What disturbed him most was her expression, which was completely different from the warm charm she had displayed just moments earlier. Her face showed intense concentration, almost clinical in its focus, as she measured various substances into his cup with the care of an apothecary preparing a precise medicinal dose. The transformation was so complete that she seemed like an entirely different person, cold, calculating, and utterly without emotion as she prepared what Hartwell suspected might be his death warrant. When she noticed him watching through the doorway, her demeanor shifted instantly back to that of the welcoming hostess. But the brief glimpse of her true nature had been terrifying in its implications. "Almost ready," she called out sweetly, her voice once again carrying that musical quality that made her seem like the perfect embodiment of Southern feminine virtue. "I do hope you'll enjoy it. So many of our guests have told me it's quite unlike anything they've ever experienced. Absolutely unforgettable." The emphasis she placed on the word unforgettable seemed laden with meaning that made Hartwell's blood run cold. He realized that she was probably speaking the literal truth. Her victims would indeed never forget the experience of drinking her special tea, since it was likely the last thing they would ever taste. As she approached carrying the cup on a delicate china saucer, Hartwell noticed several details that confirmed his worst fears. The tea possessed an unusual pink color that seemed inconsistent with any normal beverage, and it gave off an aroma that was intensely sweet and floral, with underlying notes that seemed almost narcotic in their strength. Most ominously, he could see what appeared to be tiny fragments of plant material floating in the liquid. Fragments that looked remarkably similar to the oleander petals that had been found at every death scene. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of deadly Southern hospitality that transformed one of America's most cherished traditions into an instrument of systematic murder. Hartwell accepted the cup with hands that he struggled to keep steady, knowing that his next decision would determine whether he lived to expose the truth or became another casualty of the most sophisticated murder enterprise in American criminal history. The tea possessed an extraordinary aroma that seemed to assault his senses with overwhelming intensity, sweet and floral with underlying notes that made his head feel light just from breathing the vapors rising from the cup. As Hartwell raised the delicate china to his lips, acutely aware that Lavinia was watching him with an expression of eager anticipation that seemed completely inappropriate for someone simply offering refreshment to a weary traveler, he understood with crystalline clarity that he was looking into the eyes of a predator who had perfected murder as an art form. The realization struck him that everything about Lavinia Fisher, her beauty, her charm, her apparent devotion to Christian charity, her reputation as the perfect Southern hostess, was nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to lure victims into trusting her completely. She had weaponized every aspect of feminine virtue that Southern society held sacred, transforming hospitality, kindness, and nurturing care into instruments of systematic destruction. Instead of drinking the tea, Hartwell pretended to stumble slightly as he lifted the cup, deliberately spilling the contents across the expensive Persian rug, while apologizing profusely for his clumsiness and obvious exhaustion from travel. The liquid spread across the intricate patterns of the carpet, filling the room with that intensely sweet aroma, while revealing details that confirmed every suspicion he had developed during months of investigation. Lavinia's reaction was immediate and utterly revealing. For just an instant, a flash of pure rage crossed her beautiful features, an expression so filled with murderous fury that Hartwell felt his blood freeze in his veins. The mask of southern feminine gentility slipped completely, revealing something inhuman in its cold calculation. Then, with visible effort, she composed herself and managed to recreate her charming smile, though her green eyes continued to blaze with barely controlled anger. "How unfortunate," she said, her voice maintaining its musical quality despite the obvious struggle to control her emotions. "I'm so sorry that you've missed the opportunity to experience grandmother's special recipe. Perhaps you're more tired than you realized from your journey. I'll prepare another cup immediately. It really is essential that you have the full benefit of the restorative properties. Please don't trouble yourself on my account," Hartwell replied, feigning embarrassment while carefully observing her reaction. "I'm afraid I'm more exhausted than I initially realized. Perhaps I should rest in my room before taking any refreshments. A brief nap might restore my coordination." What happened next would haunt Samuel Hartwell for the remainder of his life. As Lavinia knelt gracefully to clean the spilled liquid, several pink oleander petals that had been concealed in the bottom of the teacup became clearly visible against the dark fabric of the Persian rug. The sweet aroma rising from the spilled tea was identical to the distinctive scent that had been reported at every death scene he had investigated. More disturbing was the way John Fisher appeared instantly in the doorway, as if he had been waiting nearby for some predetermined signal. His demeanor had changed completely from the humble, helpful innkeeper he had portrayed earlier. Now he stood with the alert posture of someone prepared for violence, his eyes moving between Hartwell and his wife, with the coordination of partners who had obviously worked together in similar situations many times before. "Is everything all right, my dear?" John asked, though his tone suggested that he already knew the answer and was preparing to take whatever action might be necessary to resolve the situation. "Our guest is simply tired from his travels," Lavinia replied smoothly, though Hartwell noticed that she was now positioning herself between him and the room's only exit. "I think he might benefit from immediate rest rather than waiting until later this evening." The exchange was clearly coded communication about how to handle the unexpected complication of a victim who had not consumed the poison as planned. Hartwell realized that his survival now depended on maintaining his cover story while finding some way to escape from the inn without arousing further suspicion about his true identity and purpose. That evening, after convincing the Fishers that he was indeed simply exhausted and needed sleep more than food or additional refreshments, Hartwell lay in his assigned room with furniture barricaded against the door, listening to sounds that confirmed every suspicion he had developed about his hosts. Through the thin walls and floorboards of the old building, he could hear whispered conversations that revealed the true nature of their operation and the immediate danger he faced. "The investigator suspects something," came Lavinia's voice, no longer carrying the musical sweetness she displayed for guests. Her tone was cold, calculating, and filled with a viciousness that made Hartwell's skin crawl. "We may need to accelerate our timeline significantly if we want to avoid exposure." "How can you be certain he's investigating us?" John's reply carried a nervousness that suggested he was far less comfortable with violence than his wife. "Maybe he simply spilled the tea accidentally. Plenty of our guests have been clumsy after long journeys." "Don't be naive," Lavinia snapped with barely controlled fury. "No one spills tea that precisely unless they're deliberately avoiding drinking it. He was watching me prepare it, studying my movements like he knew exactly what to look for. Someone has connected the deaths to our operation." Through his window, Hartwell could see John moving across the moonlit grounds toward the swampland behind the property, carrying what appeared to be a heavy canvas bundle over his shoulder. The man moved with the careful efficiency of someone performing a familiar task, disappearing into the Spanish moss-draped trees that bordered Goose Creek with practiced knowledge of paths that would leave no tracks for investigators to follow. The implications were horrifying. Hartwell realized he was witnessing the disposal of evidence from previous murders, possibly personal effects, clothing, or even body parts that needed to be fed to the alligators that infested the surrounding swampland. The systematic nature of their operation was becoming clear. They had developed a perfect method for eliminating victims and disposing of evidence that left no traces for law enforcement to discover. Near midnight, the conversations below became more detailed and revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Lavinia's voice carried clearly through the floorboards as she outlined plans that demonstrated months or even years of careful preparation. The Savannah contact has confirmed that new identities can be arranged, but the cost will be substantial, she was explaining to John. We'll need at least $15,000 to disappear completely and establish ourselves elsewhere with proper documentation and references. How many more victims will that require? John asked, his voice trembling with what sounded like fear rather than moral qualms. Depends on how much each one is carrying and the value of their insurance policies. Lavinia replied with the casual tone someone might use to discuss crop yields or weather patterns. The cotton broker we're expecting next week should be worth at least $3,000 between his cash and policy. The rice planter after that might be worth twice as much if his reputation for carrying large sums is accurate. What about the bodies in the swamp? If anyone discovers what we've hidden there, the alligators have been remarkably cooperative so far. Lavinia laughed, a sound that chilled Hartwell more than her earlier fury had. By the time anyone thinks to search those waters, if they ever do, there will be nothing left to identify. Nature has provided us with the perfect disposal system. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, during which Hartwell learned details that would eventually lead to arrests far beyond just the Fisher couple. They were part of a larger network of criminals operating throughout the southeastern states, with contacts in Savannah who specialized in creating false identities, Charleston associates who helped identify wealthy potential victims, and connections in Colombia who provided information about travelers' routes and schedules. Their method had been refined through years of practice and multiple murders that had never been connected to their operation. Lavinia would encounter wealthy men during their travels, either as Laura Ferguson, the insurance agent, or through carefully planned accidental meetings at inns and taverns. She would assess their financial situations, sell them life insurance policies when possible, and gather detailed information about their travel plans and personal circumstances. When victims arrived at the 6-mile Wayfarer house, they would be treated to extraordinary hospitality that made them feel completely safe and valued. Lavinia's special tea contained oleander extract that she prepared using a recipe she had perfected through experimentation with different dosages and preparation methods. The poison was particularly effective because its symptoms resembled heart failure, and the sweet taste masked any bitterness that might arouse suspicion. After victims died, the Fishers would steal any money, jewelry, or valuable documents they carried, then dispose of the bodies in Goose Creek Swamp, where alligators would eliminate physical evidence within days. The deaths appeared to be natural. The victims had died alone without family members present to ask difficult questions, and the substantial insurance payouts provided additional profits that made their operation extraordinarily lucrative. Dawn was approaching when Hartwell heard John returning from his nocturnal activities, his boots heavy on the front porch as he cleaned mud and vegetation from his clothing. The sound of running water suggested he was washing away evidence of his work in the swampland, preparing for another day of playing the humble, helpful innkeeper. Hartwell spent the remaining hours before sunrise, carefully documenting everything he had overheard, creating a detailed record that he planned to present to Charleston authorities. He now possessed evidence of multiple murders, systematic insurance fraud, and the location where bodies had been disposed of. Most importantly, he had confirmed the identities of the criminals responsible and gathered intelligence about their broader network of criminal associates. However, his immediate problem was escaping from the inn alive. The Fishers clearly suspected his true purpose, and he had no doubt that they would attempt to murder him rather than risk exposure. His only advantage was that they probably preferred to maintain their established method rather than risk the complications that would arise from a victim who disappeared without consuming their poison. Hartwell's escape from the 6 Mile Wayfarer house required careful planning and considerable luck. At dawn, he informed the Fishers that urgent business matters required his immediate return to Charleston, apologizing for cutting his visit short, but explaining that he had received word of problems requiring his personal attention. Lavinia's disappointment seemed genuine, though her eyes held a coldness that suggested she was already planning alternative methods for dealing with him. "I do hope you'll return soon, Mr. Henderson," she said with a smile that no longer seemed beautiful but rather predatory. "It would be such a shame if our paths never crossed again. I'm certain we'll meet again under more favorable circumstances," Hartwell replied, though he was determined to ensure that their next encounter would be in a Charleston courtroom. The arrest of John and Lavinia Fisher on July 3, 1847, sent shockwaves throughout Charleston society that reverberated across the entire Southeast. Hartwell's evidence, combined with a comprehensive search of the 6 Mile Wayfarer house and the surrounding swampland, revealed the full extent of their crimes and confirmed the systematic nature of their murder enterprise. Hidden in a secret compartment beneath the kitchen floor, authorities discovered detailed records that documented 23 separate murders spanning nearly 3 years of operation. The ledgers contained information about each victim's financial status, travel plans, insurance coverage, and the methods used to kill them. More disturbing were Lavinia's notes about refining her poison recipes and her clinical observations about the effectiveness of different dosages. The search also uncovered a substantial collection of personal effects stolen from victims, jewelry, watches, signet rings, and other valuable items that the Fishers had been unable to sell immediately without arousing suspicion. Hidden cash totaled over $12,000, representing proceeds from robberies and insurance fraud that had made them wealthy far beyond what any legitimate inn could generate. The investigation of Goose Creek Swamp confirmed Hartwell's worst fears about the disposal of evidence. While alligators had indeed consumed much of the physical evidence, investigators recovered enough human remains to verify multiple victims. Clothing fragments, personal items, and bone fragments provided conclusive proof that the Fishers had been systematically murdering guests and disposing of their bodies in the surrounding wetlands. More shocking was the discovery of Lavinia's laboratory, a sophisticated collection of plants, extraction equipment, and reference materials that revealed her extensive knowledge of botanical poisons. She had cultivated various toxic plants, including oleander, foxglove, and castor beans, experimenting with different preparation methods to create poisons that were both lethal and difficult to detect, with the medical knowledge available in 1847. Her personal journals contained detailed observations about the effectiveness of different substances, notes about symptoms and timing, and refinements to her methods that demonstrated a cold scientific approach to murder. She had tested various combinations and dosages, seeking the perfect balance between reliability and the appearance of natural death. The oleander-based poison had become her preferred method because its sweet taste masked any bitterness and its cardiac effects resembled heart failure. During their interrogation, the true scope of the Fishers' criminal network became apparent. They were connected to a sophisticated organization that operated across multiple states, providing services that included victim identification, false document creation, money laundering, and evidence disposal. The network had been responsible for dozens of murders throughout the Southeast, with the 6 Mile Wayfarer house serving as just one of several killing sites. Lavinia had indeed been operating as insurance agent Laura Ferguson, using her extraordinary charm and carefully constructed cover identity to identify wealthy victims and sell them life insurance policies that would later be claimed by the criminal organization. Her success rate with potential clients had been nearly perfect because she combined genuine beauty and intelligence with complete ruthlessness and an intuitive understanding of masculine psychology. The couple's background proved as fictional as everything else about their public personas. Their real names were John and Lavinia Sorrells, and they were career criminals from New Orleans who had moved to South Carolina specifically to establish their murder enterprise. John had previously been involved in riverboat gambling schemes, while Lavinia had worked as a confidence artist specializing in seducing wealthy men before robbing them. Their transformation into respectable innkeepers had been carefully planned and executed over several years. They had studied Charleston society, learned to mimic aristocratic manners and speech patterns, and created elaborate backstories that would withstand casual investigation. Their charitable work and community involvement had been calculated investments in building reputations that would deflect suspicion from their criminal activities. The trial of John and Lavinia Sorrells became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in South Carolina history, drawing crowds from across the region who came to see the beautiful woman who had turned hospitality into systematic murder. Newspaper accounts described packed courtrooms where spectators waited for hours to glimpse the defendants and hear testimony about their crimes. Lavinia maintained her composure and charm throughout the proceedings, even attempting to flirt with prosecutors and jury members in what seemed like an instinctive response to any situation involving men. Her beauty remained striking despite her circumstances, and some observers noted that she seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention her notoriety had brought her. Her final statement before sentencing revealed the chilling pragmatism that had motivated their crimes. Men are such predictable fools when it comes to a beautiful woman offering kindness and attention. They never suspect that the hand serving them tea with a smile might be the same hand measuring poison with scientific precision. We simply took advantage of their weakness and society's stupid assumptions about feminine virtue. John Sorrells was executed by hanging on August 18, 1847, maintaining his loyalty to Lavinia until the end and refusing to provide information about other members of their criminal network. Lavinia followed 2 days later, becoming one of the first women executed in South Carolina and drawing enormous crowds who came to witness her final moments. Even facing death, she remained defiant and unrepentant. Her last words were reportedly, "I regret nothing except that we didn't have time to perfect our methods further. If society insists on treating women as helpless ornaments, it shouldn't be surprised when some of us use those expectations as weapons." The 6-mile Wayfarer house was abandoned immediately after the arrests, and locals reported that the building seemed to decay with supernatural speed. Within 2 years, the structure had collapsed entirely, as if the evil it had housed had somehow poisoned the very foundation. The property remained vacant for decades, with rumors that it was haunted by the spirits of murdered travelers keeping potential buyers away. Samuel Hartwell's investigation revolutionized insurance industry practices throughout the Southeast, leading to improved coordination between companies, more thorough background checks on agents, and systematic reviews of claims that showed suspicious patterns. His detailed documentation of the case became a textbook example of methodical criminal investigation, studied by law enforcement officials and insurance investigators for decades afterward. The broader criminal network connected to the Sorrells was gradually dismantled over the following years, with Hartwell's intelligence leading to arrests in Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. However, some members escaped justice by fleeing to territories where law enforcement was less organized, and similar operations probably continued in other regions where authorities were less vigilant. The case established new legal precedents for prosecuting organized criminal enterprises and demonstrated the need for better communication between jurisdictions when investigating crimes that crossed state boundaries. It also highlighted the vulnerability of travelers in an era when communication was slow and record-keeping was haphazard, making it easy for criminals to operate undetected across wide geographic areas. Years later, when Hartwell reflected on his investigation, he was struck by how close he had come to becoming another victim of the Sorrells operation. If he had consumed Lavinia's poisoned tea, His death would probably have been attributed to natural causes like all the others, and their murder enterprise might have continued for years longer. The case of Lavinia Sorrells remains one of the most chilling examples of how criminal minds can exploit society's most cherished values and assumptions. Her ability to weaponize feminine charm, religious piety, and Southern hospitality created a perfect cover for systematic murder that claimed at least 23 lives and might have continued indefinitely if not for one investigator's refusal to accept convenient explanations for suspicious deaths. This mystery shows us how appearances can deceive and how even our most trusted institutions can be corrupted by human greed and malice. The victims who died at the 6-Mile Wayfarer house believed they were experiencing the finest examples of Southern hospitality and Christian charity, never suspecting that their hostess was studying them with the cold calculation of a predator selecting prey. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Sorrells criminal network? Or might there have been other accomplices who escaped justice and continued operating elsewhere? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened during those final days before their capture. Were there other victims whose deaths were never connected to their operation? If you enjoyed this tale of deadly deception and want more stories that explore the darkest chapters of American history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries as much as you do. The shadows of the past hold countless secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we'll see you in the next video to explore them together.